There are nights when the mind wanders backward, not through the years we know, but through the years we've forgotten. Nights when sleep feels close but does not arrive, and in that space between waking and dreaming, something older stirs a question, perhaps a feeling that the world we live in now is not the first world, that the ground beneath our cities, beneath our roads and buildings, holds the memory of something that came before. And something that ended in the dry earth of southern Iraq, beneath layers of wind-carried dust and the ruins of empires that rose and fell like breath. There are tablets, small clay, marked with wedge-shaped signs pressed into their surface thousands of years ago. These are the tablets of Sumer, the oldest written words we have found, the first time we are told that human beings set down their thoughts in a form that could last. But if you sit with these tablets quietly, if you read them not as historians, but as listeners, something else begins to emerge. They do not feel like beginnings, they feel like remembering, like someone trying to recall a dream that has already started to fade. And in that remembering, there are images, floods, gods, who walked and then withdrew. A time before the cities, before the fields, before the order of things as we know them, a time when the world was built differently, and then destroyed. What if these tablets are not the start of human memory, but the preservation of its ending? What if the scribes of Sumer were not inventing stories, but writing down what had been whispered to them? Fragments passed from tongue to tongue, generation to generation, growing fainter with each telling, until finally someone pressed them into clay so they would not disappear entirely. What if civilization as we understand it did not begin in Sumer but was remembered there? The tablets speak carefully. They do not announce themselves. They do not demand belief. They simply describe. And what they describe again and again, in different texts and different voices, is a world that ended not recently, not within the memory of the scribes themselves, but long before, so long before that the details had blurred, the names had changed, the reasons had been forgotten. But the event itself, the great unmaking. There is a particular heaviness to reading these words now in the stillness of night. Knowing they were written by hands that have been dust for millennia, knowing that those hands were trying to preserve something they feared would be lost, and knowing that, despite their efforts, much of it was lost anyway. We have the words, but we do not have the context. We have the images, but we do not have the certainty. We are left, like the scribes themselves, with fragments. One of the oldest fragments tells of a time before the flood, not the flood we know from later traditions, not the story that traveled into Hebrew scripture and beyond, but something older, a Sumerian memory of water rising, of the world submerged, of everything that had been built, swept away. But the tablets do not only describe water, they describe a world before the water, a world that had lasted so long it must have seemed permanent, and then in a span of time the tablets do not measure. It was gone. The names of the kings are listed, the cities are named, but the details are strange. The lengths of the reigns are impossibly long. Thousands of years, tens of thousands. Some scholars read this and say, mythology, exaggeration, the ancient habit of inflating numbers to convey importance. But what if the scribes were not exaggerating? What if they were simply writing what they had been told, what had been carried forward through the long centuries, and they had no reason to doubt it? What if to them it seemed perfectly natural that the world before the flood had lasted an immense span of time? Because it had. There is something unsettling in this possibility, not because it asks us to believe in impossibly long reigns, but because it asks us to consider that time itself, as experienced by those who lived before the flood, may have been measured differently, that the world before the unmaking operated under conditions we can no longer imagine, that the pace of life, the span of memory, the relationship between one generation and the next, was not like ours. The tablets speak of gods, but they speak of them quietly. These are not the gods of thunder and war, not the gods who demand sacrifice and shout from mountaintops. These are gods who taught, who walked among the people and then slowly withdrew, the Anunnaki. They are called in some texts sky people, those who came down. But the tablets do not say where they came from, or why they came, or why they left. They simply note their presence, the way one might note the presence of the sun, something that was always there until it wasn't. There is no conquest in these stories, no invasion, no battle between gods and humans for control of the earth. There is only presence and then absence. There is only a time when the gods walked openly, and then a time when they withdrew behind the veil of heaven, and the people were left to continue alone. And it is after this withdrawal, after the gods step back, that the tablets begin to describe the end. Not an immediate end, not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow unraveling, a sense that something was breaking down, that the old knowledge was fading, that the structures that had held the world together were no longer being maintained. And then, the water, the flood itself, is described in multiple texts, each with slight variations, but all carrying the same core memory: the world submerged. Only a few survived. Those who had been warned, those who had built a vessel, those who had listened when the gods whispered one final time before falling silent, and when the waters receded. When the survivors stepped out onto the mud-slick earth, they found themselves in a different world, not just because the landscape had changed, but because the knowledge had been lost. This is what the tablets carry forward most strongly: the sense of loss, the feeling that something immense had been known and then forgotten, that before the flood, there had been wisdom, up deep, old, carefully maintained. And after the flood, they felt it. They spent the rest of their lives, and their children's lives, and their children's children's lives, trying to reconstruct what had been lost, trying to remember. And perhaps this is what Sumer really was. Not the first civilization, but the first attempt to rebuild, the first effort to gather the scattered pieces of an older world and arrange them into something coherent again. The tablets were part of this effort. They were not records of discovery, but records of recovery. They were humanity saying, "We will not forget again. We will write it down this time. We will press it into clay, so that even if the world ends once more, some trace of what we knew will remain." But even as they wrote, the scribes must have known they were working with fragments. They must have known that what they were preserving was incomplete, distorted by time, passed through too many mouths and too many generations to remain pure. And so they wrote carefully. They did not claim certainty. They simply recorded. They said, "This is what we remember. This is what was told to us. This is the shape of the world that ended before we began." And now, thousands of years later, we sit with these same fragments. We hold the same incomplete memory. We try, as they tried, to piece together the outline of a world we never saw. A world that may have lasted longer than ours has, so far. A world that built things we have not yet rebuilt. A world that knew things we are still trying to remember. The night deepens. The question remains, not loud, not urgent, but persistent. Quiet as breath. What if the world we know is not the first? What if Everests do not answer this question? They were never meant to. They simply hold the space where the question lives, carved into clay by hands that trembled with the weight of what they were trying to preserve. And if you read them slowly, if you let the words settle rather than rush past them, you begin to notice something about the way they describe the time before the flood. They do not describe it as myth, they describe it as memory. There is a difference. Myth feels invented, constructed, shaped by imagination to teach a lesson or explain a mystery. But memory feels different. Memory has texture. It has the quality of something that was once seen, once lived, and then slowly forgotten. Not all at once, but piece by piece, like a face fading from a dream. The Sumerian tablets have this quality. They stumble, they contradict themselves, they leave gaps. And this, more than anything, suggests they are trying to remember something real. In one text, the flood is sent by the gods as punishment. In another, it is described as something the gods themselves feared, something they could not stop, only warn against. In one account, a single man is saved. In another, several families. The details shift, but the event remains. The water remains, the ending remains, and beneath all the variations, there is a single persistent image, a world that was and then was not. The scribes of Sumer lived in a land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, where water was both life and threat. They knew floods. They had seen the rivers rise and swallow fields, homes, entire settlements. But the flood they wrote about was not like the floods they knew. It was total. It was world-ending. It covered everything. The mountains themselves were submerged. The tablets say, the highest peaks disappeared beneath the water. And when they wrote this, they were not describing a river overflowing its banks. They were describing something else entirely. What kind of flood covers mountains? There is no easy answer. The geologists will tell you about ice ages, about glacial melts, about sea levels rising slowly over millennia as the great sheets of ice retreated northward. They will show you evidence of coastlines that once existed far below where the ocean lies today. Evidence of lands that were dry and then drowned as the water returned. But they will also tell you this happened slowly, gradually, over thousands of years. Not in a single catastrophic event, but in a long grinding transformation that no single generation would have fully witnessed. And yet the tablets describe it as sudden, as overwhelming, as something that happened within the span of a human lifetime, perhaps even within the span of a few days. The old world in the morning, the new world by evening, with nothing but water in between. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps the geologists are right about the slow rising of the seas, and the tablets are right about the sudden breaking of something that had held the water back. That wall of ice, a natural dam, a barrier that had stood for so long it seemed eternal, until the day it did not. And when it broke, when the water was finally released, it did not creep forward gradually. It roared, it swallowed, it erased. This is speculation, of course. We do not know, we cannot know. We were not there. But the tablets were written by people who believed they carried the memory of those who were, and they wrote with a certainty that is hard to dismiss. They wrote as though the flood was not a story, but a fact. Not something imagined, but something survived. And if it was survived, then there were survivors. People who lived before the flood and lived after it. People who carried the memory of the old world into the new one. People who remembered the cities that had been lost, the knowledge that had been drowned, the gods who had walked and then withdrawn. And it is these people, perhaps, who became the founders of Sumer, not the inventors of civilization, but the inheritors of it, not the first to build cities, but the first to rebuild them. The tablets list the cities that existed before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shuruppak. 5 cities, ancient even in Sumerian memory, cities that were said to have been founded by the gods themselves, in the time when the gods still walked openly. And after the flood, the tablets say, kingship descended from heaven once more, and new cities were built. But the new cities had the same names as the old ones, the same locations, or as close as could be determined, the same structures, rebuilt from memory. This is the pattern that repeats duration. Not creation, but recreation. The people of Sumer were not starting from nothing, they were starting from fragments. They had inherited something, pieces of language, pieces of knowledge, pieces of design. And they were trying to put those pieces back together into a form that resembled what had been lost. It must have taken generation. The survivors of the flood would have had the memories, but not the resources. They would have had the knowledge, but not the tools. They would have had the vision of what the world had been, but not the means to recreate it fully. And so they did what they could. They built smaller versions of the old cities. They wrote down what they could remember of the old stories. They performed rituals they no longer fully understood, because the rituals had been performed before the flood, and that alone made them sacred. And slowly, painfully, over centuries, something like civilization, not the old world restored, but a new world built on the foundation of the old one, a world that remembered, even if it did not fully understand what it was remembering. The gods in this new world were distant. They no longer walked among the people, they no longer taught openly. They had retreated to the heavens, to a place beyond reach. And now they communicated only through signs, through dreams, through the movements of stars and the patterns of birds. The priests studied these signs carefully, desperately trying to interpret the will of beings who had once spoken plainly but now only whispered. There is a sadness in this, a loneliness. The tablets do not describe it directly, but it is there beneath the surface. in the way the scribes write about the gods with a kind of longing. They remember a time when the gods were near, when wisdom was freely given, when the world made sense because there were teachers who could explain it. And now those teachers were gone, and the people were left to figure things out on their own, with only fading memories to guide them. This is the true inheritance of Sumer, not the cities, not the writing, not the technology with the absence. The knowledge that something had been lost, the awareness that they were living in a diminished world, a world that had once been greater, fuller, more filled with presence and meaning. And this awareness drove them to preserve what they could, to write it down, to build monuments that would last. Carry the memory forward even when the living memory had died. They built ziggurats, vast, stepped pyramids of mud brick that rose from the flat plains. Like mountains remember them foreheads, they built ziggurats. Not fortresses. They were temples, but temples of a particular kind. They were reaching structures, built to bring earth closer to heaven, or perhaps to remind heaven that earth was still here, still waiting, still hoping for the return of what had been lost. The ziggurat at Ur still stands, or what remains of it stands, that massive terraced monument to absence, to the distance between the human and the divine. When you look at it now, eroded by wind and time, it is easy to see it as primitive, as the work of people who did not yet understand architecture. But the tablets suggest something different. They suggest the ziggurats were copies, smaller versions of structures that had existed before the flood, built by the gods themselves, or built under their instruction, in that older world, when the ziggurats are not evidence of civilization beginning. They are evidence of civilization trying to remember, trying to rebuild what it had seen, even if it no longer understood why it had been built that way. The proportions, the angles, the orientation to the cardinal directions, thought of this, was preserved not because the Sumerians understood the mathematics behind it, but because they remembered it had been done this way before, and what had been done in the world before the flood was sacred, not to be altered, only to be repeated as faithfully as possible. The same pattern appears in the writing itself. The cuneiform script, with its wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay, is often described as the first writing system. But the tablets themselves hint at something else. They hint that writing, like the cities, like the temples, was not invented in Sumer but remembered. That there had been writing before, in the world before the flood, and the Sumerians were trying to reconstruct it from fragments, from half-remembered symbols, from the shapes they had been told their ancestors used to record knowledge. Some of the oldest tablets are not literature or law or accounting. Long, careful lists of words, arranged by category: animals, plants, tools, stones, gods. These lists feel like someone trying to gather everything that can be named, everything that exists, and pin it down before it slips away again. They feel like the work of people who had lost their vocabulary once and were determined not to lose it again. People who understood that when knowledge is forgotten, it begins with the forgetting of names. And so they wrote the names over and over. They taught the names to scribes, and the scribes taught them to new scribes, and the names were preserved even when their meanings became uncertain. There are Sumerian words we still cannot translate, words that appear in the tablets with no context, no definition, no clear referent. They were preserved because they were old, because they had been passed down, because losing them would mean losing another piece of the world before the flood. But what they actually meant that was already gone. This is what survives a world ending. Not the knowledge itself, but the ghost of knowledge. Not understanding, but the memory that understanding once existed. The survivors carry forward the shapes of things without their substance, the names of things without their nature, and they do this faithfully, reverently, even desperately, because they know what they carry is precious, even if they no longer know why. In the quiet of night, when sleep brushes close but does not claim you, you can almost feel this desperation. You can almost sense the weight those ancient scribes carried, the burden of being the ones who had to remember, who had to preserve, who had to pass forward what had been entrusted to them even as it faded in their hands like morning mist. They were not inventing civilization. They were trying not to lose it again. the tablets describe the Anunnaki with this same careful distance. They are mentioned frequently, these beings who came down from the heavens, but they are never fully explained. The tablets assume you already know who they are. They assume the reader has heard the stories, knows the names, understands the relationships between the different gods and their roles in the time before the flood. But for us, reading thousands of years later, there is only the assumption. The knowledge itself is missing. What we do know, Naki were teachers. They were the ones who gave humanity the arts of civilization, agriculture, irrigation, metalworking, astronomy, mathematics, writing. They were the ones who laid out the first cities, who established the first laws, who showed human beings how to organize themselves into something more than wandering groups. And then, before the flood, they withdrew. They do not describe a conflict, a betrayal, a reason for the separation. They simply note that the gods, who had once been present, became distant, that the direct teaching stopped, that humanity was left to continue the work on its own. And shortly after this withdrawal, though the timeline is unclear, measured in reigns so long they seem impossible, the flood came. Was there a connection? Did the withdrawal of the gods cause the flood, or did the knowledge of the coming flood cause the withdrawal? The tablets do not say. They preserve the sequence without explaining it. First the gods taught, then the gods withdrew, then the flood came. Then the few who survived rebuilt what they could remember, and the gods, after the flood, remained distant. No longer teachers, but only watchers, silent presences in the heavens who occasionally sent signs but never again walked openly. A world where the gods had been close and were now far, where knowledge had been abundant and was now scarce, where the earth had been shaped one way and was now shaped differently, the old coastlines drowned, the old landmarks submerged, the old places of power lost beneath water or buried beneath silt carried by the flood. And yet they tried. They rebuilt the cities, they re-established the priesthoods, they created schools where scribes learned to read and write, where the old texts were copied again and again so they would not be lost. They developed mathematics to measure the fields, astronomy to track the movements of the heavens, engineering to control the rivers that had once destroyed everything. They built a civilization that would last for thousands of years, a civilization so successful that its influence would spread across the ancient world, carried by traders and conquerors and scholars who studied in Sumerian schools. But underneath all of this achievement, underneath all of this rebuilding, there was the memory, the persistent, aching memory that this was not the first time that there had been another world, older and perhaps greater, and it had ended. And if it had ended once, it could end again. This is what the tablets carry forward most powerfully, not the specific details of the flood, not the names of the gods, not the measurements of the old cities. With the awareness of impermanence, the knowledge that civilizations rise and fall, that knowledge can be lost, that the world itself can be unmade. And this awareness shaped everything the Sumerians built. It made them careful. It made them write everything down, build everything to last, establish institutions that would outlive any single generation. They knew, in a way we have perhaps forgotten, that nothing is permanent, that the ground beneath our feet has been other things before it was ground, that the rivers have run in different channels, that the seas have stood at different heights, that the very shape of the world is not fixed but fluid, subject to forces we do not control and can barely comprehend. This knowledge is written into the deepest layers of Sumerian thought. It appears in their king lists where the reigns before the flood are separated from the reigns after the flood by a single devastating line. Then the flood swept over. Everything before that line belongs to one world. Everything after belongs to another. The line itself is the ending, the boundary, the moment when continuity broke and had to be rebuilt from memory. What is striking is how matter-of-fact this line is. There is no elaboration, no dramatic language, no attempt to make the flood seem like divine punishment or cosmic justice. It is simply recorded as an event that happened. The world was one way, then the flood came, then the world was a different way, and life continued. But it continued differently with less, with gaps, with the awareness that something had been severed. The people who survived the flood, according to the tablets, were not special in any moral sense. They were not chosen for their virtue or their faith. They were simply the ones who listened when they were warned. The ones who built boats when building boats seemed irrational. The ones who prepared for something impossible, and were therefore ready when the impossible arrived. And after the water receded, they became the carriers. The ones who remembered both worlds, the world before and the world after, and had to find a way to translate that memory into something the new world could understand. This is perhaps the deepest tragedy preserved in the tablets. Not the flood itself, but what the flood did to memory. The survivors knew what had been lost. They could still picture the old cities, still recall the old teachings, still hear in their minds the voices of the gods who had walked among them. But their children knew only stories, and their children's children knew only fragments of stories. And with each generation, the memory became dimmer, more uncertain, more like something dreamed. By the time the Sumerian scribes were pressing wedges into clay, thousands of years had passed since the flood. The memory had been handed down through countless generations, distorted by time and distance and the simple limits of human recall. And yet it persisted. It persisted because the survivors had made a decision, in those first desperate years after the water receded, to never let it be completely forgotten, to tell the story again and again, to teach it to every child, to make it part of the fabric of human knowing, so that if the world ended again, there would at least be the awareness that endings were possible, that preparation mattered, that listening mattered. The tablets describe a man named Ziusudra in the Sumerian version, Atrahasis in the Babylonian texts. The names change depending on the language, the culture, the century of the telling, but the story remains consistent. He was warned by one of the gods, Enki, the wise one, the one who valued humanity enough to break the silence of the divine council and whisper through the walls of a reed house that the flood was coming. And Ziusudra listened. He built a vessel, sealed it with bitumen, loaded it with his family and animals and seeds, everything needed to restart life after the ending. And when the flood came, he survived. The tablets are careful to note that Ziusudra did not save everyone. He could not. The flood was too vast, too sudden, too complete. He saved what he could carry. A sampling, a seed bank of the old world to be planted in the new one. And this is what he became. Not a hero in the modern sense, not someone who conquered or defeated the flood, but simply someone who carried something essential through the ending and delivered it to the other side. There is a later scene in the tablets that is almost unbearably quiet. After the flood, after the waters recede, Ziusudra steps out of the boat onto the mud-thick earth. He builds an altar. He makes an offering to the gods. And the tablets say that the gods, who had withdrawn, who had been silent, came down one last time. They smelled the offering, the smoke rising into the cleared sky, and they gathered around it like hungry things, like beings who had missed the presence of humanity more than they wanted to admit. And in that moment there is a glimpse of something complex. The gods had sent the flood, or allowed the flood, or failed to prevent the flood, and yet here they were, drawn back by the simple act of a human making an offering, acknowledging them, remembering them, as if the relationship between the gods and humanity was not one of power and subjugation, but something more delicate, something mutual, as if the gods needed humanity as much as humanity needed the gods, and the flood had severed something for both sides. But the moment passes. The gods speak to Ziusudra. They grant him immortality or something like it. The life that will not end in the normal way. Existence outside of time. And then they send him away to a place at the mouth of the rivers, a distant shore where he will live forever, but will never again walk among ordinary humans. He becomes a memory himself, a figure the later stories will reference, but never quite reach, someone who exists in the gap between the world before the flood and the world after, neither fully part of one nor the other. And the gods return to heaven, the separation continues, the distance remains. This is the world the Sumerians inhabited, a world where the divine had once been near and was now far, where knowledge had once flowed freely and now had to be pursued, studied, decoded from old texts and the movements of stars, where human beings had to figure out how to live without direct guidance. relying instead on inherited wisdom, on traditions whose origins had been forgotten, but whose importance was still felt. They built their cities in the shadow of this absence. Every temple was a reaching towards something that had withdrawn. Every ritual was an attempt to maintain a connection that had been broken. Every carefully copied tablet was an act of faith that the knowledge being preserved mattered, even if its full meaning was no longer understood. They lived in a sense in the aftertime, in the long echo of an ending they had not witnessed, but could not forget. And perhaps this is why their civilization felt compelled to write everything down. Why they became the first, as far as we know, to develop a complete writing system, to create libraries, to establish schools dedicated to the preservation and transmission of knowledge. They understood, at a level deeper than conscious thought, that knowledge was fragile, that it could be lost, that it had been lost before, and they were determined, whatever else they failed at, not to lose it again. The libraries they built were not grand structures, not monuments meant to impress. They were clay brick rooms, modest and practical, lined with shelves, holding thousands of tablets. Each tablet carefully dried, carefully stored, carefully catalogued. The scribes who maintained these libraries were not merely copyists, they were guardians. They understood that what they protected was not just information, but continuity itself, the thread connecting the present to a past that had almost been erased. In one such library, in the city of Nippur, archaeologists found tablets that had been copied and recopied for over 1,000 years. The same texts, word for word, generation after generation. The scribes would note in the margins, copied from an ancient tablet, or the original was damaged by water, some words lost. They were aware they were working with fragments. They were aware that even their most complete texts were incomplete, but they copied them anyway faithfully, because the alternative was to let them disappear entirely. There is something deeply human in this, the instinct to preserve, to hold on, to pass forward what was passed to us. Even when we do not fully understand it, the Sumerian scribes were doing what we all do when we sense something slipping away. They were trying to hold it in place, to fix it in a form that could outlast memory, outlast forgetting. But what exactly were they preserving? When we read the tablets now, what are we actually reading? The question sits quietly in the dark hours. We are reading words. Certainly we have translated them, or most of them. We know what the signs mean, how the grammar works, what the sentences say. We can read the words, the flood swept over, without understanding what it felt like to carry the memory of that flood through generations. We can read descriptions of the Anunnaki, without understanding what it meant to live in a world where such beings had been present and were now absent. The tablets preserve the surface of things, the events, the names, the sequences. But the depth, the felt experience, the context, the taken-for-granted knowledge that everyone at the time would have shared, that is lost. We are like archaeologists finding half a conversation and trying to reconstruct what was said in the missing half. We can make guesses, we can piece together, but there are gaps we cannot fill. And yet, even with these gaps, patterns emerge, patterns that repeat across different tablets, different time periods, different cities, the pattern of before and after, the pattern of presence and absence, the pattern of knowledge given and knowledge lost. These patterns are consistent enough that they feel like more than literary convention. They feel like the shape of an actual experience, remembered imperfectly, but remembered nonetheless. One pattern that appears again and again is the relationship between the gods and specific human lineages. Certain families, according to the tablets, were chosen by the gods before the flood to be priests, to be kings. And after the flood, it was the descendants of these families who became the rulers and religious authorities of the Sumerian cities, as if the gods had marked certain bloodlines, had entrusted certain people with specific roles, and those roles were meant to continue even after the gods themselves withdrew. This is not presented as mythology in the tablets. It is presented as genealogy, as historical fact. The king lists trace lineages back before the flood, connecting the rulers of Sumer to figures who lived in the world that was destroyed. Whether these lineages were actual biological descent, or symbolic experience treated them as real, as meaningful, as evidence that the continuity between the old world and the new world was not completely broken. There were still families who remembered, still people who carried the blood, or the blessing, or the knowledge of those who had lived before the ending. And these people were the foundation upon which the new civilization, not because they were perfect or divine themselves, but because they were linked, however tenuously, to a time when the divine had been near. The weight of this inheritance must have been immense, to be descended from those who survived the flood, to carry a name that had existed before the world ended, to be expected to remember, to preserve, to maintain traditions whose origins stretched back beyond memory. It was not a privilege, it was a burden, a responsibility that could never be set down, never be refused, never be fully fulfilled because the fullness of what needed to be remembered was already lost. And perhaps this burden is part of what drove Sumerian civilization to such heights of achievement. The feeling that they were not just building for themselves, but rebuilding for those who came before. That they owed something to the world that had been destroyed. That they had to prove the survival, the continuation, had been worth it. That from the fragments they had been given, they could create something that honored the wholeness that had been lost. They developed mathematics that could measure the movements of the planets with astonishing accuracy. They created astronomical tables that predicted celestial events, years in advance. All of this was done not for practical purposes, not initially, but as a form of remembering, because the gods had withdrawn to the heavens, and if humanity wanted to stay connected to the divine, they had to learn to read the heavens, to find meaning in the patterns written in light across the night sky. The priests spent their lives studying these patterns, looking for signs, for messages, for some indication that the gods were still watching, still present in some distant way, and occasionally they found what they were looking for. A planetary alignment that had been predicted in the ancient texts, an eclipse that occurred exactly when the old tablets said it would. These moments were treasured. They were proof that the old knowledge was real, that the world before the flood had known something true, that the memory, however fragmentary, was worth preserving. But there were also moments of silence, long stretches when the heavens revealed nothing, when the predictions failed. And in these moments the priests must have wondered if the connection had been lost entirely, if the gods had moved so far away that even the heavens could no longer bridge the distance, if humanity was truly alone now, living in the ruins of a relationship that would never be restored. The tablets do not record these doubts directly. They maintain the forms, the rituals, the certainties of tradition. But beneath the surface, you can feel the uncertainty, the questions that could not be asked aloud but were felt nonetheless. What if the gods are not coming back? What if the flood was not a test but an ending? What if we are preserving knowledge that no longer has any divine source to validate it? These questions must have haunted the quiet hours, the moments between ritual and rest, when the priests sat alone with their tablets and their calculations, and the vast silence of the stars. They had inherited a world already broken, already diminished, and they were tasked with maintaining traditions that pointed toward a wholeness they had never experienced. It was a faith built on absence, a devotion to something that had withdrawn, and yet they continued. Generation after generation, they continued. They taught the young scribes to read the old signs. They rebuilt the temples when they crumbled. They recopied the tablets when they wore thin. They performed rituals on dates that had been sacred for so long, no one could remember why they were sacred. Only that they had always been observed. And to stop observing them would be to break another thread connecting the present to what came before. There is a particular tablet found in the ruins of Uruk that captures this feeling with startling clarity. It is not a grand mythological text or a royal inscription. It is a prayer, a simple, quiet prayer written by a priest whose name has been lost. And in this prayer he speaks to Enki, the god who had warned Ziusudra, the god of wisdom in deep waters. He does not ask for wealth or victory or power. He asks for memory. He asks that the knowledge entrusted to his family not be lost in his generation. He asks that he be worthy of what has been passed to him. He asks, in essence, not to be the one who breaks the chain. The prayer ends with a phrase that appears in many Sumerian texts, a phrase that feels like a whisper passed down through millennia. May it not be forgotten. But in them, you can feel the weight of everything the Sumerians carried. The knowledge that forgetting was not just possible but likely. That without constant effort, without vigilant preservation, the memory of the old world would slip away entirely. That each generation stood at the edge of total loss, and only their dedication, their labor, their refusal to let go, kept the thread intact. This is what the tablets ultimately are. Not history in the way we understand history, not mythology in the way we understand mythology, but something older. They are the concentrated effort of a civilization trying not to forget, trying to hold on to something that was already slipping through their fingers when they first began to write it down. And what they were holding on to was not a golden age, not a paradise lost. It was something more complex. The tablets do not describe the world before the flood as perfect. They describe it as ordered, as structured, as a place where things made sense because there were teachers who could explain them. But they also hint at tensions, at conflicts among the gods, at decisions made in divine councils that humanity was not part of, but was subject to. The old world was not Eden. It was simply a world where the rules were clear and the guidance was present. The flood itself is described in one text, the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest flood narratives we have, a kind of terrible simplicity. The storms come, the water rises, for 7 days and 7 nights the world is unmade. And then, silence. The text does not describe the death. It does not linger on the suffering. It simply notes that the world was covered. And when the water withdrew, almost nothing remained. The cities were gone. The fields were buried under silt. The survivors, few in number, stood on shores that looked nothing like the shores they remembered. And in that silence after the flood, something changed fundamentally in the line. Before the gods had been active participants in human affairs. They had founded cities, established kingship, taught the arts of civilization. But after the flood they became observers. They still sent signs. They still granted favor or withheld it. But they no longer walked openly. They no longer taught directly. Humanity had to learn to guess what the gods wanted, rather than being told clearly. This shift is rarely discussed explicitly in the tablets, but it permeates everything written after the flood. The rituals become more elaborate, as if complexity could compensate for the loss of direct communication. The prayers become longer, more repetitive, as if saying the right words enough times might bridge the distance. The priesthood becomes more important, more powerful, because they are the ones who claim to understand the signs, to interpret the silence, to know what the absent gods require. But underneath all of this there is uncertainty, a persistent, aching uncertainty about whether the interpretations are correct, whether the gods are actually listening, whether the elaborate structure of religion and ritual that defines Sumerian civilization is maintaining a real connection, or merely performing the memory of a connection that no longer exists. The tablets do not resolve this uncertainty, they live in it. They accept it as the condition of existence in the world after the flood, and perhaps this is their deepest teaching. Not that the gods exist or do not exist, not that the flood happened or did not happen, but that human beings must live with uncertainty, must build civilizations on incomplete knowledge, must preserve traditions whose full meaning has been lost, must maintain faith in the absence of confirmation. This is the inheritance Sumer passed forward, not just the writing system, not just the laws and the mathematics and the astronomy, but the awareness that we live in an aftertime, that something was lost before we began, that we are builders in ruins, trying to reconstruct what we can from fragments, knowing we will never fully succeed but building anyway, because the alternative is to let everything disappear. The ziggurats stand as monuments to this effort. Enormous structures of mud brick, rising in deliberate answers. They were built to last, and some of them have lasted at least partially through 4,000 years of wind and rain and war. But they were always incomplete, always reaching towards something they could not quite touch. Always standing at the boundary between earth and heaven, holding the space where the gods used to be. When you stand at the base of a ziggurat now, in the heat and silence of the Iraqi desert, you can almost feel what the builders felt. The determination, the longing, the stubborn refusal to accept that the separation was permanent. They built these structures not because they expected the gods to return, but because they needed to maintain the possibility of return, to keep the door open, to signal across the distance that humanity was still here, still remembering, still waiting. And in a sense, they succeeded. The gods did not return. It was passed forward, from Sumer to Babylon, from Babylon to Assyria, from Assyria to Persia, from Persia to Greece, from Greece to Rome, and onward through the centuries until it reached us. Changed, certainly transformed by each culture that carried it, but still recognizable, still containing the essential pattern. A world that ended, knowledge that was lost, survivors who tried to rebuild. We find this pattern repeated in cultures that never touched Sumerian soil, never read Sumerian tablets, and yet tell strikingly similar stories. The Greeks spoke of Agralian and Pyrrha. The Hebrews told of Noah and the Ark. Hindu texts describe Manu and the fish god who warned him of coming devastation. Chinese legends preserve the memory of Gun Yu and the Great Deluge. Indigenous peoples across the Americas, from the Hopi to the Mapuche, carry flood traditions in their oral histories, stories of water rising, of worlds ending, of small groups surviving to begin again. These cannot all be memories of the same event. The distances are too great, the separations too ancient, and yet the pattern persists with such consistency that it suggests something deeper than coincidence. Perhaps not a single global flood, but something in the human experience that gets remembered as flood. Perhaps the end of the Ice Age, when coastlines that had been stable for thousands of years were drowned as the glaciers melted and the seas rose. Perhaps multiple regional catastrophes, each devastating enough to feel world-ending to those who experienced it. Or perhaps something else, something we cannot quite name because we have never experienced it ourselves. The tablets hint at this possibility, that the flood was not just water, but transformation, that the world after was fundamentally different from the world before, not just in geography but in the basic conditions of existence, that something about how reality itself worked had changed. This is speculation, of course, the kind of thought that comes in the deep hours of night when the rational mind loosens its grip. They use language that is precise when describing the flood itself, due storms, the duration, the covering of the mountains, and then become vague when describing what came after. As if the scribes themselves were unsure how to put into words what had changed. They say kingship descended from heaven again after the flood. They say the land was dried. They say life continued. But there is a quality to the language that suggests continuation was not the same as resumption. That something essential had shifted. The measurements in the king list support this sense of fundamental change. Before the flood, individual kings are said to have ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the reigns become shorter. Still impossibly long by our standards, sometimes thousands of years, but shorter than before. And as the lists progress forward through time, the reigns continue to shorten, as if whatever allowed the long reigns was gradually diminishing, fading, until eventually the numbers settle into something closer to what we would consider a human lifespan. Scholars dismiss these numbers as symbolic or mythological. And perhaps they are, but the pattern itself is interesting. It suggests a world in decline, not in terms of morality or achievement, but in terms of something more fundamental, as if the world before the flood operated under different rules. And after the flood, those rules were slowly changing, normalizing, becoming what we now experience as the fixed laws of nature. The tablets never explain this explicitly. They simply record it. Before the flood, people lived differently. After the flood, life became harder. The long ages shortened. The direct knowledge became indirect. The world that had been near became distant, and humanity adapted. This is perhaps the most remarkable part of the story. The tablets tell, not the catastrophe itself, but the response to it. The survivors did not give up. They did not descend into barbarism. They took what they remembered and they rebuilt. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to create cities again, to develop writing, to establish laws, to map the stars, to create art and literature and mathematics, to build a civilization that would last thousands. Not that the gods once walked the earth, not that a flood once covered the world, but that human beings, faced with catastrophic loss, chose to remember and to rebuild, that they valued the past enough to preserve it even in fragments, that they built institutions designed to outlast individual lives, individual generations, so that knowledge would not be lost again. The scribble schools of Sumer were the first universities in a sense, places where young people came to study for years, learning not just to read and write, but to think systematically, to solve problems, to understand the accumulated knowledge of generations. They studied mathematics and astronomy, law and literature, language and religion. They became in their turn the guardians of memory. And what they guarded was not just information. It was continuity itself, the thread that connected the present to the past, that allowed each generation to build on what came before, rather than starting over from nothing. This is what civilization actually is, not cities or technology or political structures, but this thread, this maintained continuity, this refusal to forget the Sumerian civilization. Eventually, conquered, abandoned, buried beneath sand. The language stopped being spoken. The writings of gear, no one could read the tablets. They became artifacts, curiosities, objects dug from the earth with no voice, no meaning, no story to